This is my viewfinder. Bringing up sort of in the same thinking meditation, at least in the sort of brief Zen Buddhist reading that I do, one of the fascinating concepts I came across is that the idea of meditation as this relaxation and separation of mind and body is a bit misunderstood, and particularly this one writer I was looking at, or at least one summary of their lecture, was that the idea, for example, in Zen of the Zazen posture is that it's supposed to be uncomfortable, that you're not supposed to sit in a way that you can ignore your body. In fact, it's supposed to be the opposite, that sitting cross-legged with the erect back is actually not impossible, but it's really, really hard to do. And that only through practice can you start ignoring at first the tendency to squirm, to shift, to make small movements. And then after that, you end up ultimately looking for a way to quiet your mind, which is an interesting idea in terms of the practice of spiritualism rather than the thinking of it. And photography can be the same. Everything in life is like that. If you're the type of person that actually is already sort of spiritually, let's say, balanced or okay with themselves, you're never in an opportunity to even hear that, because the conversation never occurs. And, if I'm walking around with the camera and it's this closed loop that I'm meditating, I have this object, I press a button, I get home, that's sort of almost an ideal, a Buddhistic ideal, that you're always in a moment, you're always present, and when it's done, it's gone forever and you don't need to dwell on it. But photographers are not like that. Photographers, I brought up the example with Alvin, like, does photography still have a value if you take out a roll of film, you do 24 actuations on it, and then you throw out or bury the roll, and including you never see it again? I don't think so. I don't think anybody would do that. Then we can bring up this idea of, let's say Winogrand or George Weber, or people that have rolls of films that were never touched, but the intent was never to throw them away.
But that's almost part of the experience, right? Like, this is a very, very, very philosophical question in terms of photography, right? Like, do you shoot if there's nothing in your camera, right? Like, there's no roll of film, there's nothing, right? Ultimately, your relationship with photography should, this is all asterisk and whatever, disclaimer, right? Like, you do what you want to, first of all, but hopefully the relationship with photography for you starts to become, or for the viewer, for anyone, is like, you shoot because you want to shoot, right? Like, it doesn't, because no one else matters and you're shooting for yourself, right? So for example, you said, I leave my camera at home, but you still identify as a photographer. You're still someone who's very interested in the act of photography. So you're constantly, because that framework's in your head, you're probably, when you're out with your son playing, taking photos in your head, and you're making these memories, and they're lasting for you. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I don't know. The only reason why I'm not sure if I would agree with that is that each time and each situation will be slightly different. So, for example, to your point, if we're out for a walk, I will instinctively at this point have moments where, like, oh man, if I had my camera, that could look really dope. But if I'm running around with my kid in a field, I don't think about, it'd be great is if I was 50 meters away and had this lens, and if I could capture this.
But see, that's the thing. Like, you're getting caught up in all these semantics about cameras when it doesn't even have to be that. You know what I mean? Like, when you're out with your son, you just look at him and look at the happiness and pride and the joy that you have, and feel that, and that's nearly almost the same thing as photographing for me.
See, that's where I'm not sure I agree with that. And the reason why all I'm thinking about right now is when you talk about walking and the camera, my question is, when is the last time you've been out just for a walk?
Just for a walk without a camera?
Yeah, just to walk, to walk out intentionally for 20 minutes, an hour, 5 hours, 5 minutes, whatever, just for the sake of walking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, dude. I mean, even with my, requirement of spirituality and all this stuff.
Here's the thing with that, right? Like, I completely agree with you. Like practically, you are completely correct. Absolutely. And what I want to preface that with is, like, when we are the goal-orientated, capitalist fish that we are born into the system, like, walking without a goal, like, in mind, like, so, like, you wake up in the morning, you walk to work, your destination is to go to work, but it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, it's about being able to walk to work, and that's really nice, right? And being able to live close to work and walk close to work, or walk to work is, I think, like, a big factor in determining happiness for a lot of people. I think, personally, I would be a lot happier if I could walk to work, but I cannot because I live in the suburbs. But past that point, it's like we are inundated with, like, the goal to get to that destination because we have to do a thing, X, Y, or Z. Whereas like actual, like, spiritual liberation, or whatever you want to call it, would be like, yeah, you could just wake up in the morning and walk for 5 hours with no destination. And that's often what I do. Like, for example, when I went to Beijing, like, when I'm shooting in a different place, it's nice because, like, all of the baggage that is Danny Luong is gone. Because I'm not anyone in Beijing. I'm a fucking nobody. Probably on a government watch list somewhere, but I'm a nobody. I'm a foreigner. Right? And so I can wake up in the morning. This is what I did. I stayed with my brother. Wake up in the morning, and I would just walk in a direction. Sometimes even a cardinal one. And that would be, I had no destination. Sometimes. Other times more often than not, I did, though. But for a couple of those walks, I had no destination. And they were very liberating because there was no goal. And not having to have a goal was really nice.
Well, is that with or without your camera?
With. Every time it was with. So the goal was ultimately to take photos. And I mean, ultimately, like, the other big thing here that we're talking about too is like Alex South said it, Louis showed me this quote, was just like, photography is probably the most anti-Zen activity. Right? In the sense that you're not, like, you're stealing a moment. You're taking a moment and you're making it permanent rather than leaving it impermanent. Right? You're not. It's instead of, like, water washing through you like time, like river. You're taking a moment, you're stealing it, and you're keeping it, and you're hoarding it. And I mean, like, I think, like, to touch on a key point here, as you've called out many times, is like, one of my driving philosophies in my life is balance, and, like, the core philosophy of the yin and yang. Right? Like, I want to see both sides every single time. Because I think it leads to, like, a heightened level of understanding. For me, personally. Because being able to see both sides and play both sides and understand both sides is really nice. So the most anti-Zen activity is photography. But with duality, it's at the same time the most Zen activity that you could do.
I'm just thinking, it's interesting to think of the camera, or, like, and you brought up a good sort of comparison. I was going to say allegory, but a comparison of having a job and deciding to walk to work. So having a camera and deciding that you're going to walk in Beijing. And sort of the catch-all idea that photography in and of itself is not a Zen, it, like, doesn't align with Zen. I wonder the question of if one could be present in the walk and in the moment of being motivated to capture something, and then after moving away and walking to something else.
Like letting go.
It's fascinating, maybe it's not that process, even in its entirety, that has anything to do with being in and out of Zen. Maybe it's in the review of it and the appearance of those images and the reflection on that act that all of a sudden we break a cycle. Because, when I go out, let's say shooting on the street or doing something random for myself, I do experience what you and other people are describing, which is when you're in a good zone, whether you take a lot of pictures or not, you can actually be in a zone, and you're you just can be absorbed in a single activity.
Like, you don't have to be you anymore.
Well, I mean, I might even, I think that's a negative way of putting it. I think that you actually get to be you as opposed to having to play a role.
Sure. Absolutely. And I mean, classically, I'm kind of a negative person because like my self-talk is really negative and my self-esteem is also pretty low. So I'm like just orientated classically, and that's why I constantly do strive to see optimism and like try and recognize to be like more positive. I've been called out on it a lot by some of my closest family members and friends. Like, you gotta be more positive. And like, whenever anyone says that to you, it sounds like a load of horse shit because you're like, well, I don't know what the fuck positive. Like, how? Like, what do you want? I'm just trying to be realistic, right? Like, that's always your scapegoat. I'm just trying to be realistic, but that's wrong, right? You're totally right. But I want to say, like, again, it's that duality, right? Like, not being me feels good to me, and it makes me happy.
I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I won't delve too much into this, but I think if you need to look at anything, Danny's, the definition of me is a complex one, especially when we bring in roles that we believe we have to play for other people. And I think photography makes that much more complex, not just in its commercial existence, political existence, but even in the act of
commercial existence.
Well, no, you know, I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, bringing up your attachment to wartime photography, that's a commercial expression of journalism. I mean, when you read some of these stories about what the photographers actually were experiencing, what their favorite images are, it's generally not the ones they become famous for. And I wonder often, you know, this relationship that A, draws us to photography, B, kind of underlines photography's continued dominance in culture, is something that I don't know, maybe I shouldn't question it. maybe just let it be. One of the things about being negative that I'm learning, and quote unquote being a realist, is generally it's tied up in, I mean, ego is an overplayed word, but you know, an arrogance that I understand how things actually are, which is also, if you want to talk
just
about a Buddhist fallacy, is problematic because we're not supposed to actually understand anything. But you know, outside of
we understand anything at all.
Yeah, so like outside of like personal reflections of this stuff, I mean, just to tie it back up, in all of this being said, and kind of now we're so being where we are now. Looking back at the specific project that you displayed at the exposure show, or that you've kind of been talking a lot about, you know, with the passing of your grandfather and all of the personal work that you want to display in this case, you know, there's a relationship there that's interesting. You know, of the exposure show, I found your piece very interesting, both because you're chasing this emotional, let's call it vulnerability, and sort of pursuit of your family relationships, which is clearly a major part of your personality and your upbringing. But also you used images that I'm pretty sure were archival, like not taken by you.
That's right.
Were in
just
relationship.
to show, once again, showcase that family connection, right?
Yeah, so I mean, just briefly, because you know, we've already taken about the hour, and I've got a lot of editing to get this under 30 minutes. But what do you think about, you know, so keeping in mind the conversation we just had, you know, what's the role of photography in that project? You know, is it something that you felt you were trying to look for permanence, to honor, and to ensure that people will remember? Or is it something that happened intuitively that was expressed as, you know, something completely idealistic, like, this doesn't even matter, man, this is just this, that, and the other thing? You know, do you remember there being something specific about it? And it's an unfair question, because I think that'll change even if
it evolves, right?
Yeah, of course.
But I don't think it's an unfair question. I think most questions are fair unless they're pretty, like, even if a loaded question, you can identify those things. But regardless, like, I guess starting with that is the first thing is like the scope of the project, and that's the whole overarching narrative, right? That was kind of the EP. I'm working on a book. the title of the project is called Departing. And it's going to highlight and focus kind of, there's a text element, and the text element is going to be, that I've already finished mostly, is my mother talking about leaving Vietnam and never really feeling at home there, about how, children in Vietnam made fun of her because my grandma's a half French. So she would never belong. She was raised in an orphanage. And then it's just about like a feeling that I still carry with me, that it's just like you never really fit in anywhere. No matter where you call home, you still feel like an outsider. And it's interesting because with the death of my grandfather, I feel more Canadian than I ever have in my life, because now I can say that, both my grandfathers are buried on Canadian soil, and no one can take that away from me. Because I felt like an outsider my whole life, and it's nice to feel that I have roots here now. I don't have to go back to wherever the fuck I came from in order to view or see my heritage. It's right here. And that gives me like a fierce sense of pride about being Canadian. So that was the best thing that happened when my grandpa died, is I started to realize that. And I think that death is always intermingled with those things, like, because change is simultaneously the worst thing in the world and the best thing in the world, right? Because you have to see what it does. It feels bad because you want things to stay normal, because you enjoy the status quo, or you think you do at least. But moving back to the project, sorry, I just kept shooting. And that was one of the things I wanted to do, was like, I identified as a photographer, and I kept shooting and I kept shooting and I kept shooting. I brought the camera everywhere, and it got to a point where, like, my family and my friends, everyone that I know and I'm so thankful for, knows that this is kind of what I want to do. And they don't mind. So they let me in with unfettered access. And when I started reviewing kind of the bulk of my work, I realized that so much of it told a story that resonated with so many other second and first generation Canadians. Like, even down to the details of my grandparents' house, of like where the laundry was, how things were set about, where the rice cooker was, where the little shrine to Buddha was, and what colors were around it. Like, all of these experiences were shared amongst so many different people, spanning entirely different generations and spanning entirely different upbringings with entirely different families. But I never see that story told. And that was the biggest thing for me. And so I wanted to start telling, not necessarily that story, because I can only tell my story, right? And so that's where the project kind of came about, right? And the audio element of the Buddhist monks chanting, that had been something I had been hearing, because in the past, year and a little bit here, I've already been to 6 funerals. So it's like I kept hearing these Buddhist chants, because it's like this little box, and they just keep it there to have like 24. Even the idea of it is absurd, right? Because you put this little chanting box in a room, and now the spirit of the dead person can have 24/7 holy chanting for them to make sure that they're okay, or ascend, or go wherever they need to go. But this is gonna help, which is absurd because that person's dead. And what I started to have a really nice forge a relationship with was like the absurdity that surrounds death, and even like me taking photos of my grandfather or my grandma because they're older, plays into that, because it's all absurd. Like, why do we venerate and like worship almost death when we should have? And I mean, like, this is with an asterisk too, is like when we should have just worshipped life. But I think we do, right? And I think, like, I just mostly, one of the big things that you touched on really early on was kind of like how this digital age that we live in, it feels like you're living in like this like soup of lies, a soup of like almost not real, you know, like it's just like Photoshop this, you know, edit that, like clean that up, like make it look better than this. And I think a lot of that has to do with social influencing and like how that plays into people's psyche. And what I wanted to do and what I always want to do is go counter to that, right? If the mainstream thing, and it's not because I think it's cool or whatever, it's just like I want, like I said, one of the primary directives of my life is balance, and I don't see enough of the real. So all I want to shoot is real, and real is often to me just death, because that's the realest shit you got. You know what I mean? Like everyone has to do it, and everyone has to go through it, and so it's almost like if I could just shoot that and put that on my feed, then I'd be very fucking happy, because I don't want to have shots that are like, look at me on vacation. And this isn't, again, to downplay anyone who is into social influencing, because whatever you want to do, that's fucking cool, man. You do you, right? But for me, that wasn't the path, because I don't want to, you know, show people how good my life is. My life is great, but it's also terrible. It's both simultaneously, all the time, which is exactly how it should be, right? And so I guess that's the crux of the project in that regard, where it's like I want to shoot what I think is real, and these stories for second generation Canadians and immigrants, like at that show, I almost, like, what brought me close to tears was right after was like, you know, someone reached out to me on Instagram, they DM'd me and they're like, hey, like I saw your piece, like you don't know who I am, but I just want to tell you, like, as an immigrant, like I looked at your stuff and like it really hit home, and I felt an emotional connection, and like I loved your work, and like I got that a lot, and that really meant something to me, because that was exactly what I was going for. It was really validating, and I want to also say, you know, like the first time I put my work on a wall at Phil and Sebastian's with you through Perspectives, that was also another moment of validation for me, because it was like I saw how many people loved me, I saw how many people wanted to support me, and I asked myself, like it's not even about like if I can fail or why could I fail, or about failure in general. It's like I'm doing this for myself, and everyone is like super into that, and they're supporting me, and I'm very lucky to fucking have that. And it would be misery for me personally if I couldn't continue, you know. And there was another line that my friend Stephanie said to me, is like, even if we didn't have a platform to share our work, like, because I didn't actually get into exposure, I only got in through the Camera Store show, and so it was very conflicting for me, because it felt a little bit like nepotism. I don't know if I want you to put this out, right, because it's like a little bit sensitive, right? But I mean, like, I'm gonna talk to you about it, and if you want to, that's totally your call, right? But it was just like I only got into a show because I worked at the Camera Store, not through my own artistic merit.
That's not
right?
true.
Well, I mean, like, you say that, but that's why I was there, because I was the Camera Store staff.
Well,
So you see what I mean, though, right? It smacks a little bit of nepotism.
No, you know what? What's interesting for me, Danny, is what we've always connected on is that you want to be a storyteller. And photography, I think what you're projecting is that in its purest form as an art, can and maybe ought to be used in a storytelling capacity. And in your case, in a documentarian mindset, to tell a story of your personal experiences and your personal beliefs, and then your struggle with those experiences and beliefs. And I think there's great value in that. I don't think that being selected or being shown has anything to do with an evaluation of your ability or the story that you have to tell. I think instead that, you know, what I'm hearing from this conversation is that there's something in the technology and maybe even in the action of it that is truly benign and detached from valuation, and then it becomes the role and responsibility of the photographer, as well likely as the audience itself, to try to color that thing in the most constructive and spiritually balanced way possible. I think the problem is that A, we're not aware of that responsibility, and B, even when we are, there are outside forces like we brought up, let's say capitalism and personal profit and commodification, the idea of photography and art as a commodity, which are, which is where
Huge
I get,
concepts.
and that's where I'm stuck, because I'm like you, or describing yourself. I think I'm even more so like I'm kind of an asshole about this stuff. I don't want to be forgiving or patient about those themes. I kind of want to just keep poking my finger at it.
At the festering wound.
Yeah, who am I? Who am I to argue about any of this shit? But I'm gonna. I think it's fun. But it's good. I'm glad I talked to you. I think that the most important thing I'm getting out of this, anyways, Danny, is that there's a story that you're compelled to communicate. That photography for you is the medium through which you're going to try to have that conversation with people. And my sort of hope is that you understand that that being recognized by one person or 10,000 is irrelevant.
I completely agree.
So don't beat yourself about exposure. Exposure is its own thing.
No, and I'm not, right? Like, that's the thing. Like, I'm still, like, at the end of the day, I was very happy I did that show.
Yeah.
I was, and I was, I'm ecstatic that I was given the opportunity. But I'm just saying that there were some things, like, going into the show that were difficult because it was like
we had
I wasn't right, and I wasn't selected through a panel or anything like that. Right, it was very validating because once again, like, Donna from Exposure came to see it, and she had asked me, like, oh, did you submit to Exposure? And I said yes, and she just kind of said fuck, and I was like, okay.
Well, that's the
but
thing.
She doesn't have anything to do with the judging panel, so.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, again, we'll have another conversation about audiences, external validation, motivations to do this stuff. Even communication tools requiring audience. I mean, that's its own. I mean, there's 1,000 tenets you could.
And ultimately, the best way to sum all that up with in terms of external stuff like that is, like, it doesn't fucking matter. You gotta do this shit for you, right? Like, it matters, yes, but, like, you have to have the drive to do it first.
So that was our talk. What do you think? I think there's enough of a focus on being present and living the practice to make a connection here. There's a quote I came across. The quote is from someone named Danny Luong. I apologize if I said that incorrectly. You cannot see the path, you can only see from it. Wow. So are we trying to look for the path, or are we looking out from it? I'm probably more the former. This podcast seems to be essentially that. But I think photographers like Danny tend to be the latter. Whether he is aware of it or not, just participating in projects like his reflection on his family lineage and his recent passing of his grandfather, they seem to be actions toward balance rather than thought experiments trying to label them. Okay, let me know your thoughts. Help me out, subscribe to this podcast, comment, rate me, share with your friends. I want to keep this momentum up. But I also want to have these conversations evolve as we go along, so any criticism or opinion is welcome. Hope you're all out there continuing to act the truth rather than to simply think on it. And by act, aptly, actuate those shutters, people.